right before my secondary interviews, my grandfather passed away. So we traveled to Korea for this funeral. First funeral that I'd been to where someone I was related to had died without Christ. And that just really shook me. I really was questioning, like, what am I going to do with my life? I was really frustrated with the church at times. Big C church. It just didn't match the church that I read about in the New Testament.
Welcome back to Anchored and Devoted. This is Pastor Joseph and...
Hey, I'm Pastor Jer. Welcome. Dave, who else do we have with us? It's Friar Day, right?
Really? We're going back to that again? We got Pastor Lee, brother in Christ. He is my boss. Do not get me in trouble.
I'll try to be good.
Famous last words. Oh my goodness. What are we going to do? That's right. We're going to try and behave, even though I know you well enough to know you'll ask the first awkward question that comes to your mind. But welcome, Pastor Lee. This is, again, Anchored and Devoted for the new believer and the seasoned believer. Let's get it started.
Mitchell, thank you for joining us. We are really glad to have you with us. I had the privilege of having the lead pastor from my church on as one of our guests, and now we have the pleasure, Dave, of having lead pastor from your church on.
I'll start by, the reason why I'm laughing, Mitchell, is the last question my brother ended with when he interviewed his pastor.
It was the penultimate, not the last.
It wasn't the last? It was in the middle somewhere?
That's right.
Okay, he asked for a raise, and I thought this was the best way to get fired on the podcast was to ask your boss for a raise without giving him any heads up. I'm not asking for one. I just put that out there because if you've listened to any episodes, you'll laugh and be like, you know what? Okay, that is hilarious. Now,
nice.
We want to hear...
It was a hypothetical. It was a hypothetical.
Okay, I'm going to go listen to the episode again. I don't remember the hypothetical part. But anyway, how did you come to faith in Christ? How did you come to know him personally?
So a little bit about me. I'm a second-generation Korean American. My parents immigrated to the United States in 1974, and my dad was the first believer on his side of the family. And so part of his conversion was going to a church, a little Korean American or Korean immigrant church in Silver Spring, Maryland. And I was 6 years old when we first started going there, and it was when I turned 8. I remember it was 1983, March 13th, and there was a couple who would come in to the church to help with the children's ministry and all that sort of stuff. We're a fledgling congregation, especially for the second generation. So, we were worshiping in English and children's, church, Sunday schools, that's all in English, but my parents were worshiping in Korean. And so there wasn't many people who could serve in places like that. So there was a beloved Caucasian couple, Mr. Jeff and Miss Robin. To this day, I don't know. I couldn't point them out in a lineup, what they look like, but I do remember them sharing the gospel with us. I was a good kid, did well in school. I'm in second grade, third grade, right? And didn't really feel like, I didn't have any need. But when hearing the gospel and how the Lord had created me in His image, but my own sin separated me from Him, the invitation was given, and it was a sincere invitation, and it was a sincere response. I raised my hand, I bowed my head and closed my eyes, at least one of my eyes. I did look around and look to see who else was looking around there. And I prayed to receive Christ. And, even as a youngster, it's like, okay, was that really legit? Well, I can tell you, so that Sunday, I went home and I went across the street to George Contreras' house. I knocked on his door. He was my buddy. And I said, George, come out here. You got to hear this news that I just heard. And I just responded to, and we sat on the curb by the street light in front of my house, and I shared with him as best I could the gospel message that I had just heard. And
that's all.
He prayed to receive Christ too. Now, I don't know if that was legitimate or not, if I just peer pressured him into it, but one way or the other, the same day I came to Christ, I won my first soul. So that was pretty amazing.
That's fantastic.
That's how I came to Christ. Yeah, in 1983 as a second grader, and it was significant enough that I remember the date. And
That's awesome.
So did they dunk you right after that, or they made you wait, or how does that work?
Yeah, as growing up in a Baptist church, you'd think they would dunk me right away, but I was resistant, and I just, though my walk with God was real, and I didn't really feel the need to get baptized until actually my sophomore year of college. So it was 20, so it's 12 years later. That's when I got baptized.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So you've been in Maryland for, your entire life, more or less?
Except for there was, so let me see. I was born and raised in Maryland. And then when I got married, that was back in 2004, I moved to Chicago.
Okay.
Actually, prior to that, I lived for a year and a half in Korea right after I graduated college. And then came back here, moved to Chicago in June, came back in July, got married, moved out in August, and we were there for 8 years. So we'd like to say my wife and I became adults in Chicago.
I'm still trying to do that.
Yeah.
Not in Chicago, just wherever I happen to be. So how did you sense the call to enter the ministry?
I was just sharing this actually with somebody over lunch today. So it was not as intuitive or as clear as I think some might testify to. My whole life, I thought I was destined for med school. In fact, even my high school years, my freshman year, I started the Young Future Medical Professions Club.
Please tell me there's the photo somewhere. Please tell me there's the photo.
So, but I to last I heard that it's still going on. That club.
Oh, wow.
I don't know.
Okay.
But there were, just to put it in perspective, there were 5 founding members, and 4 of them became doctors.
Oh, good. That's good odds, right?
Except yours truly.
I'm sure we can get you in a doctoral program. D-men.
So through college, I went to University of Maryland. Did all my pre-med stuff, took my MCATs. Wanted to really go to Temple University. There was a great cardiology program at the time. And right before my secondary interviews, my grandfather passed away, my dad's dad. They had a very broken relationship. It's a whole nother long story. So my dad, instead of going to the funeral, he sent me and my mom in his place. So we traveled to Korea for this funeral. First funeral that I'd been to where somebody I kind of knew. I wasn't that close to my grandfather. We're a continent away, but someone I was related to had died without Christ. And that just really shook me. It really rocked me. I really was questioning, what am I going to do with my life? I was really frustrated with the church at times, just big C church. It just didn't match the church that I read about in the New Testament. And my grandfather died of cirrhosis, which is a basically, drinking disease, liver disease.
Right.
And while he was on his deathbed, my mom had called several churches to come and visit him, and we found out that not a church didn't make it. There wasn't a church that made it. So that added to this increasing frustration and discontent with church. I was a little discontent with the church that I was volunteering at, attending. And I sat in I remember a smoke-filled coffee shop with my non-believing uncle, and he tells me, I don't care if you're a doctor, lawyer, engineer, what matters at the end of your life is that you did what you were supposed to do and the people called you a good man. And he wasn't thinking ministry. He was just speaking generally. And that really shook me. And I was like, what am I called to do? And what's going to allow me to live, quote unquote, the good life, a life of purpose and meaning. And that's when I really began to explore ministry. I'd been serving, I'd been leading as a volunteer, worship leading, directing so many different things in student ministries.
Mm-hmm.
Came back, talked to my pastor. My pastor was like, yeah, what took you so long to figure that out? And I was like, oh, that could have been useful before I spent the whole summer studying for my MCATs. Would have been great. And so then I was like, oh gosh, I have to explore this. I have to tease this out. I told my dad with trembling that I didn't want to go to med school, but rather wanted to go to seminary. He didn't talk to me for 2 weeks, which is quite a feat because we lived in the same house. Yeah, he just didn't speak to me. I found out later that I'd walk into the room and he'd walk out. And maybe he'd sigh a little bit. I don't know. I'm sure there was some of that in there. But yeah, man, I was like, and then suddenly he breaks the silence 2 weeks later, and he's like, okay, well, if you're serious about this, I want you to move to Korea, go live with your uncle who's a pastor, and cut your teeth, learn your heritage, learn the language. Because never in my wildest dreams did I think I would serve in anything but a Korean American church context. That's what I was training for. That's what I was preparing for. That's what I was learning for. And that's how the beginning of the call to ministry started.
Did you go to seminary in Korea, or did you start there and come back here? Or what? How did that?
Yes,
work
I
out for
took
you?
a year of seminary in Korea, not because of anything except I just wanted to learn language and culture, and particularly not just like Korean language in general. I could speak Korean, I could get around, but church Korean language,
Okay. Yeah.
Korean church talk, right? Just like
How
every
do you
church
say
has its own
mercy?
church talk.
How do you say Trinity and baptism? Words that typically don't come into everyday language.
Yep, some of those things, but then also like not even just doctrinal, Jeremy, but like also, in the South when I went to seminary, they were like, "Oh, we're gonna have a homecoming with dinner on the grounds," and you're like, "What the heck does that mean?" Right? Like, I thought only high schools do homecoming, right? Dinner on the grounds, like we're not going to eat on tables, like it's just all those kinds of things. And every church has those things. Every church
Yes,
subculture
yes.
has those kinds of things.
Yeah, we call them
Black
pop
church, you talk
provisions.
about right, pop
Mhm.
provisions.
Yeah.
Black church will talk about a watch night service. You're like, what's a watch night service? Where does that come in? So it's not even doctrinal. It's just cultural language. When in a more responsive congregation, the preacher's taking long, and Dave Joseph, how do the people give the preacher a bit of
A high
encouragement,
sign?
Well, they will tell you outright.
right?
They
And they'll
will
say
preach.
things like, "Bring it in, come on,
That's
bring
right.
it in, land it, bring it home."
They'll say amen. They'll make it abundantly clear it's time to end.
Yep. And
Abundantly.
so it's that kind of thing where I was just learning that kind of language, and so I did a year of that in Korea. Imagine trying to study Greek as a native English speaker in Korean. So you would translate. I would translate something. It was crazy. I would translate something from Greek into English, and then have to look up a dictionary to translate it from English into Korean. And it was taking me so long for my assignments. Finally, my professor was like, "Hey, I can read English. Just do it in English. It's fine." So
How
I
much
was
would
grateful.
how much would you pay for Google Translate then?
Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh!
We
That
had a
would
friend
have been amazing.
back in Bible college. We had a friend who came over. His first experience with English from South Korea was when he got to the campus for Bible college, and he dove right into like Bible Doc 1, bibliology, and probably Bible survey with not a stitch of English. And I used to watch Joe. I mean, I don't know how or when he got any sleep, because he was studying English on his own and then translating the texts as best he could to then study. I mean, it was a tremendous job. I think he went on to finish his doctorate at Southern Seminary a few years ago.
Yep. There are many like that. I was probably one of the few who did it in reverse. And so, yeah, it was very formative time. I cut my teeth on ministry. It was a very international ministry. It was the first time I was exposed to worker oppression, migrant workers. All that doing ministry in Korea was pretty, like, sweatshops, factories like that. We would lead a Bible study with some guys from the Philippines and Nigeria, and they were just crammed in like sardines in this little, it's terrible. But that was before it was even like on the radar for anybody. That was 90, 98, 99. Oh my gosh, that's a crazy story with sweeping movements and chapters. There's probably 10 chapters in there. From Korea, I started, like I said, I was really discontent about the church. Felt like the church needed to be something different. came across a book by a guy named Bill Hybels called Rediscovering Church.
Mm.
And that was at the heyday of the Willow Creek movement. And I was like, man, this thing's speaking about everything, that every discontent I had about the way church was done, speaking to it. Well, we had no resources to reach international students in Seoul at the time. And so we had to really partner with other English ministries, international ministries in Seoul. And there was one church that had one. And so we partnered. We did a lot of things to reach students. And there was a leader there who was not kind of on staff at that church, but not. And he was from Chicago, and he was been sent there by Willow, of all places, to start a Willow Creek Association among Korean churches. And I started talking to him, like, I'm reading this book about your church. And he goes, well, they have internships. You should apply. And I'm like, internships? What the? I didn't even know churches had internships. And long story short, I applied. I got in, left Korea, came to Maryland, bought a car. 2 days later, put everything in my car, drove to Chicago, and I spent 5.5 months in Chicago on an internship, learning about leadership and ministry planning, and then went to seminary. And that's actually where the first seeds of Chicago kind of got put in my mind and heart, because I eventually moved to Chicago because my internship leader, who stayed in touch with me, was attending a different church, and he thought that I would be a good student ministry pastor for his kids and at that church. So that's why we ended up moving there. And the story of coming to grace was crazy, man. It's just one of those God pieces. We were visiting Maryland on a vacation for my sister's 30th birthday. We got some news from some family members. They were really hurting, and we needed to get them into a church. We didn't think a Korean church would be able to meet their needs. So we're like, well, my sister's been attending this small group at Grace. Let's go check out this Grace Community Church. I go show up, and it's like nothing like what I anticipated. And so I walked down because I didn't know any better. I just walked down after the service and introduced myself to Mark Norman and said, hey, I just want to introduce my brother-in-law to you and, my sister-in-law. And they just, they could use your ministry here. And he's like, what do you do? I said, I'm a pastor, teaching pastor in Chicago. He's like, oh my gosh, you want a job? I was like, what?
Hold
on. Right?
That's the second time I've talked to someone at Grace who on their first time there was asked if they wanted a job.
It's nuts, man.
Chris did that with me. I was like, what in the world?
Did they do that to you too, DJ?
Yes, I was in the balcony and Chris Wolf turned around and goes, do you want to work with the men's ministry? And I was like, you don't know. Like, I'm literally holding David in my arms. It's time to meet and greet. He's like, what do you do? And I was like, hey, I'm, a pastor as well as I'm a teacher. And he was like, hey, you want to work here at the? And I was like, what? Like, who does this?
That's amazing.
We just exchanged names, and obviously
that's when you got to mess with them.
Exactly.
No, you got to mess with them. Be like, yeah, I would love to. I have to let the Kingdom Hall know that I'm
I was not thinking that swiftly on my feet.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
We got there is probably something to that. We should probably do a genogram study of the church, of Grace Community Church, to see how much that just kind of plays a piece into that invitation, that relational invitation. But
I'd be curious. I mean, first time you meet someone, and then being on staff, I then went and met Tim when Chris was being announced as a campus director, and that was when Tim announced he was leaving. And God made it clear to me I was supposed to be here, even though I was doing other stuff. It was like, this is so that is a unique thing, at least for me, for Grace. And it also is one of those things where you say, okay, no matter what craziness is going on, I know I'm called to work here. I'm called to serve here. I'm called to love others here. And, I can look at that and go, yeah, that was a God thing. Like, until he frees me to something else, you got me. And so that's, it's interesting to hear that in your story as well.
Did that take you, how much time did that take you to discern, DJ? Did you kind of have that impression right away?
No, I didn't have that impression right away. Because I was trying to rest. I was coming out of a burnt out space. And so I was like, okay, I need a space to rest. And then I had been praying for, God, what are you doing in general? And Chris and I engaged for probably 2 or 3 months, and he was still focused on me being the pastor to men's. And I told him, I was like, that's not really my wheelhouse. Not that I wouldn't love doing it, just not my wheelhouse. I'm more of the counseling person. And so when I went to the family meeting, and no, I was not a member yet, but I was there.
You rebel.
My elder invited me, and Tim announced that he was leaving. God made it real clear. It was like I was sitting on the back row crying for like 15, 20 minutes, just like, I can't believe this. And I did the same thing. I went to the front and I was like, hey, Tim, I'm your replacement.
Nice.
And he was like, what? And I was like, I'm your replacement. I know it's weird. And he was like, there are other people that are interested. I was like, good for them. I'm still your replacement. We can do the interview process. I'm fine with it. We went through it. But I knew then, I was like, this is so done. Yes, I'm your replacement. And
wow.
Yeah.
So Mitchell, how long from that first offer of a job was it before you landed here permanently?
Well, so the crazy story within that was that, that was October 9th, 2011. And again, I know that date because it was my sister's 30th birthday.
Okay.
And we were I actually said, when he said, do you want a job? I actually said no. And he gave me his card. He said, look, I don't know who you are, what your resume is, but we just literally turned this over to a search firm. If you'd be at all interested, you could send your resume to this person, and they're doing all our vetting. And so I walked out, and my wife's, I must have looked shocked. She was like, well, are you okay? I said, yeah, he just offered me a job. She's like, what? And so we were driving home to Chicago, and I was like, there's no way. And the reason I was saying no way, Jeremy, was at my church in Chicago, my senior pastor had just talked to me about succeeding him. And the interview process with our elders was not supposed to start until September of 2012, the following year. So there was no way I was going to jump ship before engaging that process. And so I was like, they're not going to be able to wait till September to even entertain it, like Grace. And so, no, that's okay. Well, I get back in October. That weekend, I get back, and senior pastor calls me in the office. He goes, hey, the elders have been praying, and we want to actually move up the process of interview. We don't want to do it next September. We want to do it in a few weeks, starting in November. So I'm like, what? And I must have looked shocked and dazed. He's like, is that a problem? I said, well, gosh, I was just in Chicago, and I was just in Maryland, and I'm at this church, and they want me to put my name in the hat for this teaching pastor role. I'm not even sure what it is. I'm even not sure what the church is like. And he goes, so my senior pastor goes, so what's the senior pastor's name? I said, Mark Norman. And he goes, oh, I know Mark Norman. I was like, what? And he goes, yeah, we did ministry together in New England, and I actually hired one of his associates away from him, whatever, da-da-da. And he gave me, it was funny. It was really funny.
He had like a jacket on. He was like, all right, this is Mitchell. He's in the church right now. It's time to tit for tat.
I guess so, right? And I'm so grateful for his name was Dave McDowell. I'm so grateful for Dave's wisdom and humility, because he was like, so I was like, what do I do? And he said, well, if you feel like you need to put your name in the hat, do it. Just, you don't need to let the elders know until you're a serious candidate. And when you're a serious candidate, then you can. I had never done that before. So I put my name in the hat at Grace, and turns out, like, it's literally not even the 11th hour. It's like the 11th hour, 45 minutes before they're about to call in candidates and do this presentation at Grace. And I put my name in, I email it, this consultant or the search firm person calls me. And she's like, hey, I just saw your name come through. Mark told me your name might come through, but we've got, tomorrow we're sending these, this candidate profile, 3 names. We think you might be a good candidate, but we do a, in-person interview for every person. And I'm like, well, I don't think that's going to happen by tomorrow. And she goes, actually, I live 20 minutes north of you. Can I come drive down meet you at Starbucks.
Wow.
So I'm like, what? So she drives down 20 minutes. We meet at Starbucks. She does this interview, does her due diligence, puts me as a name of the candidate. And turns out I didn't win any competition. The other two candidates withdrew their names. So they were stuck with me, man. And I don't think I've ever told anybody that part, actually. But, they were stuck with me. And that's how we ended up coming. And I remember I was still doing the interview with the church in Chicago. I was speaking at a conference in Thailand. And on one morning, I get an offer from Grace Community Church to be the teaching pastor. And the next day, I get an offer from Community Fellowship to be the next lead pastor.
Wow.
And it was like a divine neutrality, guys. I was like, all right, Lord, just let it tell me. And it was just quiet, silence. And almost as if the Lord was like, no, you choose, I will bless you, And
Yes. Yeah.
But the big piece in it was Sarah. Sarah did not want to move back to Maryland. My wife, Sarah. And we had really established a life there. We were really involved in a lot of different, not just local church ministry, but neighborhood ministry, refugee ministry.
Mm-hmm. We
were engaged in a lot of those things. And she was like, why? I felt like I had heard earlier from the Lord, like, move back to the land of your youth, right out of Genesis 23.
Mm-hmm.
And, but Sarah hadn't. And so there was a lot of conversation, hard conversation, waiting, silence, patience. And I finally remember it being in the lobby, calling Mark Norman saying, hey, we want to come. And he was shocked. He thought for sure I was going to say no, actually. And we ended up moving. And it was the first year here was the worst of my life.
I mean, just the fact that there was more. What was it that gave you peace to know Maryland was the choice? Even though you knew, kind of like for me, it was one of those things where I knew, okay, no matter what happens, this is a fit. God spoke to me on the back row. This is a fit. I stepped into a position, and yes, I had a lot of work to do. But I'm from Maryland, so it wasn't the same kind of thing, What gave you, especially as we're talking to new believers, what gave you the mindset to say, okay, I'm not going to go with what's even easiest or comfortable, but, I think God is calling me to this.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned like the idea of comfort, because, one of Sarah and my deep conversations was, well, why does the harder thing have to be more spiritual? That's what she was saying, right? It doesn't have to be necessarily. But as I look back now in reflecting, I think what drew me back to Maryland was, well, first of all, I did feel like there was I had a word from the Lord of like, go back to the land of your youth, and that was one of them. The second was like, I could not envision living in Maryland outside of a Korean subculture. That's all I had known in Maryland. And so here was this like predominantly white church asking me to come and be the teaching pastor. That just was like really weird. The third thing was that I felt like there just was an edge of ministry on the East Coast, in the Mid-Atlantic, in the shadow of DC, that was different from the western suburbs in the shadows of the great Jerusalem called Wheaton College. And, you got Trinity, you got Moody. Those institutions just have this way of shaping the air where, like, the western suburbs, I think the city and different parts are a different feel. But there was just this kind of like Christian-y vibe the western suburbs gives you.
Sure.
Whereas the coming back here, just the sheer secularism felt like there was a challenge and an edge to ministry and gospel contextualization and this sort of stuff that appealed to me. When I look back, I'm like, I loved our church. I loved the people at our church. But I think I was more enamored with receiving the baton than I was actually the ministry that would have continued there in Chicago. And so that was part of why we decided to move, it made it more palatable.
I'm glad you talked about that, because I wanted to ask you specifically about, and maybe pivot here a little bit, You started off wanting to be a cardiologist. The heart's been important to you, and then it turned into caring for people. And while you were in South Korea, you're working very closely and continuing in Chicago, very closely with very hurting populations, very down and out. I'd love to hear about how your heart for ministry was used both to direct your steps here, but also now the way that it informs the way that you pastor, the way that you lead, the way that you conduct and direct ministries in the context that
Yeah, that's a great question. Still very much in process. I've always cared about, particularly refugees. I've always cared about the marginalized. And when I look back, it's interesting. When I look back on my ministry in Chicago, the young men who surrounded me for one reason or another, and that I made disciples of, were men who didn't have dads. There was just a constant refrain. When I get to Grace Community Church and start the work of disciple making, I look at the line of men that I've had the opportunity and the honor of discipling, and most, if not all, are alcoholics.
Mm.
I don't know what it is. Like, I don't, I remember one of the guys, and I can say this because he said it. He's like, Mitchell, I don't know what it is about you, but drunks find you attractive, and I was like, okay.
That's
That's a t-shirt right there.
Yeah, that's
Right.
a summer t-shirt right there.
Right. So, just being engaged with those people, the refugee work that we've been able to begin here at Grace. But I tell you, the challenge on all of that is just the sheer size of our church. And, so I was here 4 years. It was not part of there was no plan in place when I landed here to become the lead pastor, to succeed Mark Norman, which is what ended up happening 4 years later. But I remember when Mark Norman first pitched the idea of me succeeding him in a transition plan happening, I was like very reluctant, because I was really wrestling with the question, like, can you really pastor a mega church? Can you really shepherd people from a distance? And I mean, I really wrestled with that. I sat down with a pastor who had been pastoring for 45 years, and I said, Pastor Glenn, is this possible? Can you really pastor a mega church? I remember his answer to me was so simple, but yet mind blowing. He goes, if you want to. And that really hit me, because it's like, no, you could just go into the, you could just get into the mold of just being a CEO and just a removed person and just lead the ministry and be a pulpit personality and just do that. Or you can try to shepherd the people that the Lord sends your way, because if he's called you to do that, he's going to send you people. And it's kind of the second option is what I've tried to live out of. But it's hard. It's hard, it's hard to keep those, the people that you're really passionate about, the overlooked, the least of these in your day to day, because you're just pulled and, by so many other things.
What is something that really encouraged you in your faith as you've been journeying? Again, this is still geared toward the new believer, or what would you like for the new believer to hear from your heart? Hey, brother or sister, this is my word of encouragement.
My word of encouragement is, especially for new believers, don't settle for a cheap discipleship. And what I mean by a cheap discipleship is just a discipleship that is, okay, let's just get you like thinking the right things and all the right doctrines, and like, let's just get all the right theological precepts and principles in you. Like, all that's important. Absolutely. Like, knowing the scripture, the story of God, so important. But there's a whole other aspect. There's whole new other aspects of you as a person that the Lord also wants to bring under the lordship of Christ. And, my encouragement is like pursue a whole discipleship. Like here's a litmus test. If you're learning and you're reading books and you're listening to sermons and you're understanding wonderful truths about the doctrines of the Christian faith, yet you are still a jerk, something is amiss. And I'm like, man, we can start earlier with people to not let them settle for like, oh yeah, I'm just a jerk. I'll always be a jerk, but I understand the Trinity, right? And I'm like, man, no, don't settle. Don't settle. God wants to redeem and transform all of you.
Yeah, we've been talking about that as far as
Mm-hmm.
from the relationship, a full relationship, not just the head, but
Mm-hmm.
as you stated, all
Mm-hmm.
of you. And often
Mm-hmm.
discipleship is at least in the church, it's a systematic academic approach as opposed to the
Mm-hmm.
relational, transparent, vulnerable approach that is seen in other places. So cool.
True that.
Even like your family of origin and how, it's like we don't want to go into that because we're like, oh, that's too psychotherapy, that's too family systems theory and all that stuff. And it's like, wait a second.
Yeah, we hate that stuff.
Right? Like, I don't want to go into that. I don't want to, and it's like, hold on. Like all of that stuff. Like God has used that to form you as a unique being, but there's things that we have to unlearn. There's things we have to bring under the lordship of Christ, even those areas. And so, it's like,
I was talking with my wife about this the other day, and I said to her, this is my take after reading scripture and knowing the Lord. After the final judgment, when God has ended life as we know it here on earth and life has started in eternity, either for the damned or for the redeemed, I believe at that point, everyone, regardless of where they are spending eternity, will say in their hearts, this is right. And while there will be gnashing of teeth for those who are damned, they will not be gnashing their teeth because an injustice has been done. But they will have to, having bowed their knee, having declared Jesus Christ as Lord to the glory of God the Father, him having taken lordship of all things, they will say, no, this is right, and I hate it because it didn't have to be this way.
Yep.
He's going to have everything. Mm-hmm. Mitchell, I want to thank you for your time. I want to be cognizant of the fact that you have things to do. Where can people find you if people want to follow you? How can they do that?
Yeah, I haven't really been that active on social media. If they want to follow me, they can go to REVMLEE. That's my handle for both the gram or the book. If you want to follow me on social, but I'm not really that active there. Really, the best place is grace.community. It's our church website. I do have an author site, mitchellee.com, and it's Mitchell with one L and then Lee with one L, and you put them all together, and it's .com. I did write a book. It came out 2 years ago, a little bit under 2 years ago, called Even If, and you can take a look at that. If you go to my website, though, it'll point you to all those places, and there's ways to email me that way. And I'm just trying to eliminate a little bit of the distractions from social media and things like that, and learning to or wanting to connect in different ways. So those are the best ways to do it, either through my church or through my own website.
Excellent. Well, there you guys go. Thank you very much for being with us. For you, the listener, if you want to reach out to us, you can do that by dropping us a line, either anchor.fm or at anchoredanddevoted@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love for you to share this, pass it on, and check out Grace Community Church, where both Pastor Joseph and Pastor Lee serve. And we will see you next time. God bless.